He impregnated his own daughter twice before she even reached the age of 15. This is the story of Willard Dawson, the most incestuous father ever exposed in the state of Georgia, a case that, in the 1970s, shocked the small community of Rabun Gap. A family isolated in the Appalachia Mountains, where dark secrets remain buried by generations, a reality many would rather have never known, until the inevitable collapse revealed it. Rabun Gap, Georgia, 1978. A mountainous region where time seemed to run more slowly than in the rest of the country. Isolated communities, protected by deep valleys and precarious roads that made access difficult for outsiders, maintained their own traditions. It was in this scenario that the Dawson family built their own reality, away from external looks and the laws governing conventional society. Willard Dawson, 42 years old in 1978, was a descendant of one of the first families to settle in that region back in the early 19th century. His ancestors had arrived as pioneers, claiming the tall lands where they built a small rural property. Over generations, the Dawsons became known for their isolation and distrust of strangers, rarely coming down to the city except for essential supplies. The Dawson property was approximately 12 kilometers from the nearest city, at the end of a dirt road that became impassable during heavy rain. The main house, a two-story wooden structure built by Willard's grandfather, was visibly deteriorated. A partially collapsed barn, a water well, and some areas of cultivation completed the property where Willard, his wife Martha, and his 5 children lived. Martha Dawson, born Martha Collins, was Willard's second-degree cousin. The two had married when she was only 16 years old, following a family standard of unions between relatives dating back generations. Martha had an erased countenance, eyes always lowered, and she rarely spoke in the presence of strangers. At 38, she appeared much older, the result of a life of deprivation and the physical and emotional wear from multiple pregnancies in precarious conditions. The couple had 5 children, 3 boys, Jacob, 19, Thomas, 17, and Samuel, 10, and 2 girls, Sarah, 15, and Rebecca, 8, all shared similar physical characteristics, below average stature, asymmetrical features, and obvious dental problems. Jacob and Thomas already showed signs of erratic behavior, alternating between periods of apathy and explosions of unexplained aggression. The story we are about to report began to surface when Sarah Dawson, then 15, was taken to the regional hospital after passing out during a rare visit to the city with her father. What doctors discovered that day would open the doors for an investigation revealing decades of a practice modern society considers one of its greatest taboos: improper relationships between members of the same family, resulting in children with serious development problems. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If not, subscribe now so you don't miss impactful stories that reveal the darkest secrets of American families. These are truths that few have the courage to tell, but they need to be known so they are never repeated. Dr. Richard Thornton still clearly remembers the day Sarah Dawson arrived at Clayton's Community Hospital. It was a cold October morning in 1978, and the 15-year-old was unconscious when her father carried her into the emergency room. Willard Dawson explained that his daughter had passed out while carrying shopping and that it was not the first time this had happened in recent weeks. "There was something about his behavior that bothered me from the first moment," Dr. Thornton said years later. The way he avoided eye contact, how he insisted on staying by her side, and how nervous he seemed when we suggested more detailed tests. The initial exam revealed Sarah was extremely anemic and dehydrated, but it was during the more complete assessment that the truth began to emerge. The teenager was pregnant, approximately in her 5th month. When confronted with this information, Willard was visibly agitated, insisting he should take his daughter home immediately. It was at this critical moment that nurse Elaine Parker, with over 20 years of experience in delicate cases, intervened. Realizing signs of possible vulnerability, she created a private moment with Sarah while her father was referred to fill out administrative forms. "When we finally stayed alone, I asked her about the pregnancy," Elaine reported later. "She looked at me with the emptiest eyes I've ever seen and said simply, Dad said it's like that with all the girls in our family. This dialogue, done almost in a whisper, was the first indication of the horror happening on the Dawson property. Noticing the severity of the situation, the medical team immediately called the local authorities. Sheriff David Miller, who commanded the Rabun County Police Department at the time, arrived at the hospital less than an hour later. Willard was arrested for questioning, while Sarah was kept under medical observation. The authorities obtained a search warrant for the Dawson property, where they found Martha and the other 4 children. The house revealed alarming living conditions. Although there was electricity from a diesel generator, there was no running water or proper sewage system. The rooms were scarcely furnished, with mattresses scattered across the floor. There was little food in the pantry, mostly canned goods and some vegetables from the family garden. Most disturbing, however, was the discovery of a girl of about 2 years old hidden in a room at the back of the house. The child, who was not in any official record, had several worrying physical characteristics: a head disproportionate to her body, very remote eyes, and difficulties moving and communicating. Martha Dawson, when asked about the child, revealed through tears that this was Emma, Sarah's daughter, and that Emma's father, according to Martha, was Willard himself. Preliminary investigations revealed Sarah had given birth to Emma when she was only 13 years old. The girl had never been officially registered, had never received medical attention, and her existence was unknown to any authority. Sarah was now pregnant again, also by her father. As the investigation advanced, an even more disturbing picture began to emerge. School records showed Sarah had attended the local school only until she was 10, when Willard stated he would educate her at home, something that never happened. The 3 boys had also abandoned school early, while Rebecca, the youngest daughter, had never been enrolled. Neighbors from the nearest properties, even if a few kilometers distant, reported they rarely saw members of the Dawson family. They appeared in town maybe 3 or 4 times a year, always with 1 or 2 of his children, never the whole family, a local merchant reported. They bought large amounts of supplies and returned to the mountains. If you tried to start a conversation, Willard cut it short fast and left. The investigation also revealed the family survived mainly from the occasional sale of animal skins that Willard and the older children hunted, as well as small-scale subsistence agriculture. Ancient documents showed the Dawsons had received a significant inheritance from a distant relative in the early 1960s, which explained how they could maintain the property despite limited income. But the darker aspect was just beginning to be revealed. The family standards of consanguinity dated back at least 3 previous generations. Ancient county records indicated Willard's grandparents were first-degree cousins, as were their parents. This pattern of relationships between close relatives had created an extremely close genetic lineage, resulting in a number of physical and cognitive problems that became more evident with each new generation. As Sarah Dawson recovered her strength in the hospital, her story began to take shape through the fragments of information she shared with the social assistant designated for her case, Elena Winters. With patience and sensitivity, Elena managed to gradually gain the teenager's confidence, a teenager who had been raised to distrust anyone outside the family. "The world outside is dangerous and full of people who want to separate us," Sarah repeated, clearly reproducing what she had been taught throughout her life. "Dad always said that only within our family could we be truly safe." The reality emerging from these conversations was deeply disturbing. According to Sarah, when she turned 12, her father began to treat her differently. He explained that in their family, it was tradition for parents to teach their daughters what their adult life would be like. Martha, her mother, had been quietly complicit, having herself had a similar experience with her father decades earlier. When Sarah became pregnant for the first time at 13, there was no search for medical attention. Martha, using knowledge transmitted for generations, acted as a midwife in Emma's birth. When asked how she felt about giving birth, Sarah demonstrated a disturbing lack of understanding of what had really happened. "Dad said I was special because I managed to give the family a new, perfect member," she explained with devastating simplicity. He said Emma was more perfect than the others because she came straight from him to me. Sarah's medical and psychological evaluations revealed the devastating impact of the isolation and horror she had lived. Although she was 15 years old chronologically, her cognitive and emotional development was significantly delayed. She showed difficulty understanding abstract concepts, had a limited vocabulary, and, more worryingly, showed no awareness that what she had suffered was wrong. If you are feeling deeply impacted by this story, you are not alone. Leave in the comments, "Justice for Sarah," to show that we cannot tolerate children growing up in environments of exploitation and negligence. Your voice is important so these stories are never forgotten. Meanwhile, the investigation into the other family members revealed more layers of this disturbing case. Jacob and Thomas, the older children, showed clear signs of cognitive deficit. Psychological evaluations indicated both had intellectual development equivalent to that of children aged 9 to 10, despite being 19 and 17 years old, respectively. Samuel, 10, and Rebecca, 8, also showed significant developmental delays, as well as health problems like hearing difficulties, congenital heart problems, and dental malformations. Emma, the daughter of Sarah and Willard, underwent a series of medical evaluations that confirmed the initial suspicions. The 2-year-old girl had multiple conditions resulting from consanguinity. In addition to the observed physical characteristics, heart problems, low immunity, and significant neuromotor development delay were detected. Doctors estimated she would probably never develop cognitive abilities beyond those of a 4- or 5-year-old child, even in adulthood. Martha Dawson, when she finally started talking to the authorities, revealed that her own story mirrored Sarah's. Born Martha Collins, she was the daughter of a first-degree cousin of Willard's father. At age 15, she was offered to Willard as his wife, continuing a cycle that, according to her, was considered normal within that family branch. "My mother told me that this was how things were always done," Martha explained in a recorded statement. She said that keeping the family blood pure was important, that mixing with strangers brought weakness. The investigation revealed this thought had deep historical roots. The Dawsons' ancestors came from the Scottish Appalachians region in the early 19th century, bringing beliefs about the importance of maintaining pure family strains. Isolated in the mountains of Georgia, far from the social and cultural evolution of the rest of the country, these distorted beliefs not only survived but intensified over generations. The most alarming discovery came when investigators found diaries belonging to Willard's grandfather, written between 1910 and 1935. In these diaries, Edwin Dawson described in detail his disturbing vision for preserving family purity and how he had instructed his son, Willard's father, to continue this practice. The diaries also contained almost clinical observations about the results of these unions, noting the physical characteristics of children born and which were considered successful or flaws. These documents provided crucial evidence that the practice of consanguinity in the Dawson family was not an isolated case involving Willard, but a deliberate system maintained for generations, resulting in an increasingly compromised genetic line. Willard Dawson's trial began in March 1979 and quickly became one of the most notorious cases in Georgia's legal history. The prosecution, led by Howard Reeves, presented a meticulously built case supported by physical evidence, medical records, and the devastating testimonies of Dawson family members. The Rabun County Court, a red brick building built at the beginning of the century, could barely accommodate the public interest in the case. Journalists from Atlanta and even national publications accompanied each development, while Clayton's small community tried to process the fact that such a horror had existed for so long, so close to them. Willard remained impassive throughout the process, rarely showing any emotion. His defense lawyer, a state-designated professional who clearly struggled with the nature of the case, tried to build an argument based on his client's cultural isolation and ignorance of modern social laws and norms. "My client is the product of generations of isolation in the mountains," argued the lawyer. He was raised believing these practices were normal within his family, without access to proper education that could have corrected this distorted view. This argument, however, was quickly dismantled by the prosecution, which had evidence that Willard frequently went to the city, had a functional radio on the property, and had even worked briefly in a local sawmill in the early 1960s before inheriting the family property. He had sufficient knowledge of the outside world to understand his actions were condemned by society, argued Prosecutor Reeves. The most impactful testimony came from Martha Dawson. After months of psychological counseling, she finally managed to break decades of conditioning and talk about her experience. In a trembling voice, she described how she was handed over to Willard as a teenager, how she was kept isolated, and how she eventually became a silent accomplice to the horrors perpetuated against her own daughter. "I knew it was wrong," she admitted, tears running down her face. "But when you spend your lifetime being taught that questioning means treason to the family, you lose the ability to oppose. I failed my daughter, and I will never forgive myself for it." The medical and psychological experts who witnessed explained in detail the devastating effects of continued consanguinity over generations. Dr. Lawrence Freeman, a geneticist at Emory University, presented a detailed study of the Dawson family tree, demonstrating how the increasingly restricted genetic pool had resulted in a concentration of harmful recessive genes. "What we see in the Dawson family is a textbook example of the dangers of endogamy," explained Dr. Freeman. "When close relatives have children together, the likelihood that harmful recessive genes manifest themselves dramatically increases. In the case of this family, where this practice has occurred for at least 4 consecutive generations, we see a cascade of genetic problems that have become progressively more severe." The doctor described how the problems observed in Willard and Martha's older children, from cognitive deficits to heart problems and physical malformations, were direct consequences of this pattern. But it was when discussing Emma, the daughter of Sarah and Willard, that his testimony became even more impactful. "This child represents what we call extreme endogamic depression," he explained. "When a father has improper relationships with his own daughter, who is already the product of a consanguineous lineage, the result is an even greater concentration of problematic recessive genes. The chances of serious developmental and health problems exceed 70%. The medical reports on Sarah's second pregnancy, still underway during the trial, indicated the fetus already showed signs of multiple developmental complications. Doctors predicted that if the pregnancy reached full term, the child would likely have even more severe conditions than Emma. As the trial advanced, the community began to question how such a situation could exist for so long without intervention. Local school officials were criticized for not properly investigating when the Dawson children stopped attending classes. Social assistance authorities faced questions about the lack of accompaniment visits to the isolated family with multiple children. Prosecutor Reeves directed part of his accusation to the systemic failure that allowed the Dawson tragedy to continue for generations. "This is not just a man's judgment," he declared in his final argument. "It is the trial of a society that closed its eyes, a system that failed to protect the most vulnerable, and a culture of silence that allowed the unthinkable to happen just a few kilometers from where we are sitting today." After 7 days of trial and only 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with the verdict. Willard Dawson was found guilty of all accusations. Judge William Hartford, visibly shaken by the case, issued the maximum sentence permitted by Georgia law at the time, 3 consecutive 25-year prison sentences, ensuring Willard would never leave prison. 45 years have passed since the Dawson case shocked Georgia and the entire country. The consequences of that terrible history continue to reverberate, not only for the survivors but also as a powerful reminder of the dangers of extreme isolation and community neglect. Willard Dawson died at Georgia's State Penitentiary in 1997 at age 61, never expressing remorse for his actions. Martha, after serving 5 years in prison for complicity, spent the rest of her life in a community-assisted living facility for people with mental disorders. She died in 2012 of heart complications, another common result of generations of consanguinity. The fate of the Dawson children followed several paths, all marked by trauma and the genetic consequences of their birth. Jacob and Thomas, the older children, never were able to live independently due to their cognitive limitations. Both spent decades in institutions for adults with disabilities. Thomas died in 2010 due to renal failure, and Jacob is still living under supervised care. Samuel, who was only 10 years old when his family was discovered, had the opportunity to receive specialized education and intensive care. Although he never completely overcame his cognitive deficits, he eventually managed to learn a craft and lives today in an assisted community where he works in an adapted carpentry workshop. Rebecca, the youngest daughter, perhaps was the one who best responded to intervention. Adopted by a family of university professors, she received special education and extensive therapeutic support. Despite her learning difficulties, she was able to complete the equivalent of high school and today works as an assistant in a local library, having found stability and a significant degree of independence. Sarah Dawson, whose involuntary courage exposed the case, faced a long and difficult path of recovery. The second pregnancy resulted in a boy with multiple serious conditions who died before completing his first year of life. Sarah spent years in intensive psychological treatment, gradually understanding the magnitude of what she had suffered. At 19, she took an extraordinary step. She decided to talk publicly about her experience. In an interview with an educational documentary filmmaker in 1982, Sarah, then with a clearer understanding of what she had lived, expressed her desire that her story would serve as a warning. "I don't want anyone else growing up thinking that was normal or acceptable," she said at the time. "I want people to understand that isolation is not protection. It is prison." Emma, the daughter of Sarah and Willard, grew up under specialized care, facing multiple medical and developmental challenges. Despite the pessimistic predictions, she exceeded some expectations, managing to develop basic communication skills and some degree of independence in everyday activities. However, she never exceeded the cognitive development of a 6-year-old child. Emma died in 2001 at the age of 25 due to congenital cardiac complications. Sarah eventually managed to build a life for herself. After years of therapy and remedial education, she married an assistant teacher she met during a rehabilitation program. There were no more children, a conscious decision based on both her trauma and the genetic risks she carried. She dedicated her adult life to volunteering in family isolation prevention programs and detecting signal signs. The Dawson property in the Georgia mountains was eventually demolished by order of the county, which considered the site a monument to human tragedy. The area has been reforested and today is part of a nature reserve, without any indication of the horror that existed there for decades. The most important legacy of the Dawson case, however, was its impact on public policies and social conscience. After the trial, the state of Georgia completely revised its child protection protocols and monitoring of families in remote areas. New laws were implemented, requiring regular checks on families who opted for home education and creating a more robust school abandonment detection system. The medical community also learned valuable lessons from the case. The Clayton Community Hospital developed specific protocols to identify signs of improper relationships, and the training of health professionals across the region began to include modules on detecting genetic problems that may indicate consanguinity. Genetics experts extensively studied the Dawsons' medical records, scientifically documenting the devastating effects of multiple generations of consanguinity. These studies are now used in educational programs around the world, clearly illustrating why taboos against relationships between close relatives exist in virtually all human cultures. In 2008, a prevention and education center received the name Project Sarah in honor of Sarah Dawson and her survival journey. The center, located in Atlanta, offers educational resources and support for survivors of improper relationships, as well as training professionals to identify signals from families at risk. Sarah passed away in 2019 at the age of 56, leaving a legacy of courage and transformation. At her funeral, dozens of professionals who had been inspired by her history to work in protecting vulnerable children were present. One of her last wishes was that her story be told not as sensationalism, but as a painful and necessary reminder that extreme isolation can create spaces where the unthinkable becomes reality. The Dawson history reminds us that even in the deepest shadows of society, there is the possibility of intervention, healing, and change. It also reminds us of our collective responsibility to be aware of the signs that something is wrong, not to look away from discomfort, and to ensure that no child grows up believing that suffering is normal or acceptable. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If not, subscribe now to access deep investigations into cases that society prefers to forget, but we need to remember to prevent them from repeating. If you watched so far, it is because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. Don't forget to like this video and share it with people who value knowing the truth, however difficult it is. This was the story of Willard Dawson, the most incestuous father ever exposed in Georgia, and the lives that were forever altered by generations of isolation and consanguinity. A story that reminds us that even in the most remote communities, no one should be beyond the reach of protection, education, and law.